right, I think I'll get us kicked off so that we can maximize our time together. So I'm Zab Johnson. I am Wilma's host for this vision seminar. For those of you who don't know me, I'm in the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative, so I'm on the dark side of campus, but I'm very much a vision scientist. It is really my absolute pleasure to be able to introduce Wilma today. Dr. Bainbridge is a cognitive neuroscientist whose research has really largely been to reconceptualize memory as a visual attribute. She was an undergraduate at Yale, spent a couple of years, I think, in Japan after being an undergraduate, maybe thinking about robotics and other kinds of things, and then went on and did her PhD at MIT with Ode Oliva, where I won't give away some of that work, but because I think she's going to show us some of it. But thinking about how there are some faces that are more memorable than others, and then thinking about that from a feature space, which is really super interesting because in large part, right, we can identify and tell apart different people's faces, but as a visual stimulus, there's not that much differences between the kinds of faces and the features that you look at. Then she went on to the NIMH to do a postdoc with Chris Baker. And she started her own lab at the University of Chicago in 2020, where she's been ever since. And she really does use a combination of behavioral studies, computational modeling, and neuroimaging to think about how the brain encodes and retrieves our visual world. She's received numerous awards, including a Sloan Award, an APA Rising Star Award. I've been sort of tracking her. I've been a fangirl from the side. It's been really awesome to have her here. And she was just awarded with tenure, an award that people don't talk about that much. And one of the key aspects of some of her work that I've always found really fascinating, I'm not sure she's going to talk about it today, but involves studying aphantasia, which is a condition in which individuals lack the ability to sort of mentally visualize images inside their minds. And I think that there's always been such interesting approaches that Wilma's work has done on that point, including things around how both sort of aphantasics and other normal people draw things from memory as a probe of recall, and then using sort of computational approaches to really drill into how you quantify drawings without all the subjectivity that usually occurs in those contexts. So without further ado, I'll let you do it.
Thank you for the really kind introduction. And unfortunately, I'm not going to talk about aphantasia drawing. And I also am not going to talk about neuroimaging work that we have. So feel free to email me if you have any questions about any of this work later. So I'm going to start off with a visual memory experiment. It's my slide. Okay. So I'm going to show you a stream of face images. And what I want you to do is clap your hands when you recognize a face from anywhere earlier in that stream. Okay, you guys ready? And is it showing? Okay. Okay, clap your hands when you recognize a repeat. Here we go. Interesting. So even though I'm meeting many of you for the first time today, and many of you have never seen these faces before, you actually acted exactly as I would have expected. So I put this face in here to get you used to the task, to make sure you're paying attention. So actually, you guys didn't fall for this face, but this face causes a lot of false memory. So some of you might have felt like you saw this face before and maybe you wanted to clap. You guys were clearly confident about seeing this face twice, and you were indeed correct. And that's what I expect, because I know he has a really memorable face. Unfortunately, you guys were not as confident on clapping for this face. And this is also what I'd expect because I know she has a really forgettable face. But that's not always bad because you can be a great spy or a great movie extra, okay? So, but what this reflects is that there's some stable property to images that governs what we remember and forget. In other words, images have this intrinsic memorability, which I define as the likelihood for remembering that image. And one way we can test this is we can run this same task, but online with thousands of participants. And we have them do the exact same thing where they see a stream of images, and then they press a key whenever they identify a repeated image instead of clapping their hands. And in that key press, we get the hit rate or the proportion of people who correctly recognize the image. In the first presentation of that image, we also get a false alarm rate, or the proportion of people who incorrectly thought they saw the face before, even though it was their first time seeing it. And then what we can quantify is how consistent is memory performance across observers, or in other words, do people remember and forget the same items? And we can analyze this by taking all of our participants and splitting them into two random halves. And the key question is, do these two random halves of people remember and forget the same images? So we can look at what are the images that the first half of participants best remember or worst remember, sort of plotting their memory performance for the images on this line here. And then the question is, what happens if we plot the images in the same order in terms of their memory performance for the other group? Does it look something like this chance line here in gray, where if we just shuffle the order of the images? Or does their line look very much like the line for the first group? And what we find is that they do indeed coincide. So basically what this shows is that for these two groups, they tend to remember the same images and they tend to forget the same images. Like they have similar memory performance for these images. And we can calculate the rank correlation in memory performance between the two groups. And we find this significant high correlation. And we find this not just for hit rate, but also for false alarm rate as well. So what this shows us is that people tend to remember and forget and even false alarm to the same images. And this means you can think of an image as having an intrinsic memorability. Like this is a highly memorable image to people. This is a highly forgettable image to people. And we found these effects not just for faces, but also for a whole range of stimuli, such as scene images, face identity. So if you're memorable while you're smiling, you're also memorable when you're looking away. We've seen these for words, these stimuli that even have relatively low visual information, but rich semantic information. And in recent work, we also find these effects for more dynamic stimuli, like they're intrinsically memorable dance moves, no matter who's doing the move, whether it's a human or a stick figure. And there's also intrinsically memorable voices, regardless of what those voices are saying. And so we think this consistency across people and what they remember might reflect something fundamental about the mechanisms of memory. And so today I'm going to talk about two main lines of work in our lab. One, looking at whether memorability affects generalized to memory out in the real world. And then second, I'm going to talk about what we think makes something memorable. So if memorability is a property to a stimulus, this means that you can directly compute it from an image. And so we've done this by creating a deep learning neural network called ResMem, which is currently one of the state-of-the-art networks in memorability prediction. If people, and feel free to interrupt me if anyone has questions, by the way. So I won't go into a lot of details about the architecture, but the basic idea behind ResMem is that it is pretty much like a visual architecture, like what we use for image categorization, except it has two branches, one that does deeper semantic processing with 150 layers, and then one that's shallower that does more low-level visual processing with about 8 layers, and then we combine those two branches together. And then we take this architecture and we train it on people's actual memory performance in that same task you guys did at the beginning of this talk for 60,000 photographs from the real world. And so this is how ResMem does. So in blue here is a distribution of actual memory performance from real people, our ground truth memory performance. And in orange are the predictions made by ResMem. And its predictions have this high correlation of 0.68 with human memory. So we can actually do a pretty good job at predicting what people will remember in terms of photographs in this online continuous recognition task. Yes.
So sorry, the output is just how memorable the picture is?
Yeah, you feed it an image and it tells you its memorability score, like the proportion of people it thinks will remember that picture.
Because presumably you could actually have the model sort of do the task or like work on similarity.
Oh, yeah.
Or maybe it effectively does that and then combines that. Well, no, because you're just worked on individual images. Yeah.
Yeah, this is for individual images. So it actually has no information about context yet.
Or-
Like what are the other images in the experiment? Yet it still shows these high correlations with people's memory performance.
Actually, I want to ask you though, is this two branches, like, does it not work if you have both of those? Like, what's the?
It works if you have just one deeper branch, but we find that it does gain a little bit by having them separate. Yeah, but so far it seems like really it's the semantic branch, the residual network side that's doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Yeah. And so if anyone wants to try out the network and play around with it, try out different architectures, we make it publicly available on our website. It's like a easy to install Python package, but also you can just go to our website and then upload a picture from your phone or your computer and it'll give you the memorability score without ever needing any coding knowledge. So if you just want to check are the stimuli in your experiment matched for memorability, you can go ahead and do that easily. And so in this first part of the talk, I wanted to discuss whether memorability effects generalize to the real world. And so we were thinking, when in the real world do we look at images with the goal of trying to remember those images? And so we realized, oh, maybe when we visit an art museum, we actually want to remember that experience of seeing pieces of art. Oh yeah, this, has anyone who here has seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off? Okay, great. Yeah, this is a good ad to come visit Chicago because it all takes place in Chicago. So we want
to visit Chicago.
and come visit me. But so we were curious to test what do we remember in a museum visit? And the answer is not obvious because you might imagine that so many different factors influence our memory for an art museum visit because the appreciation of artwork is very personal. And so you might imagine our memories would be really idiosyncratic. And also these museum visits involve more than just viewing images like in an experiment, right? There's a spatial component of where the pieces are located, how big they are, temporal component of how long you visit each piece in what order. There's a social component of how you discuss the piece with your friends, the emotional component of your mood at the time. There's like prior knowledge that you might have about some pieces over others, etc. There's so many factors that would influence what you remember when you visit a museum. Even so, my very entrepreneurial former undergraduate Trent Davis decided to tackle this question by running a study at the Art Institute of Chicago, where that famous Ferris Bueller's Day Off scene was filmed. So come check out the Art Institute when you visit. And he wanted to ask, first, is memory predictable across people for artwork at all, given its highly subjective nature? And then second, is memory predictable across people in the real world? So first, we want to see, can we predict people's memory for artwork because it's so subjective and people come in with all these different priors, right, about artwork. So we took the entire Art Institute's collection of about 4,000 paintings, and we ran an online experiment with over 3,000 participants doing that exact same task you guys did at the beginning of this talk, where participants saw a stream of images and then had to press a key when they recognized an image from earlier. And our question was first, how consistent were these online participants in their memory for these pieces of artwork? And so we can do that same analysis where we split our participants into random halves and see how well their memory performance correlates versus a chance level. And what we find is that the two halves of participants show really high correlations. So in other words, people tend to remember and forget the same pieces of artwork. And so memorability can be considered as intrinsic to artwork as well. We were then also curious how our neural network ResMem would fare, given that it was trained on real world photographs. So we took all of the pieces in the collection, fed them into our neural network, and got a predicted memorability score for each piece. And when we correlate those predicted memorability scores with people's actual memory performance, we find a significant correlation. So in other words, our neural network can predict what pieces of art people remembered or forgot in this online experiment. So this shows that even though it was trained on real world photographs, similar properties govern what people remember and forget for artwork. But we're curious then, how would this do in the real world? Yeah.
Okay, so I was curious, I think up until like when you were just showing the face images, I feel like someone could make the argument that instead of being like an intrinsic property of images, it depends on like the full space of images that you use. And so to generalize to the real world, it like really depends on like getting like naturalistically sampling from the world. But do you think that this part of the experiment argues that because ResMem is like trained on like totally separate images that that's not likely where this memorability effect is coming from.
Yeah, I'd argue that the memorability effect reflects some sort of similarities that exist in the visual statistics of our world that govern what photographs we take and also what art pieces of art we create. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, so then we were curious, how well does ResMem do if we test people's memory for art out in the real world? So to test this question, we had 20 participants come visit the American Art Wing of the Art Institute of Chicago. This was right in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think it was 2020, 2021. So it was great in that it was when the Art Institute was at limited capacity. They're at like a 25% capacity. So that means our participants really got like extensive, they didn't have a blocked view looking at the famous pieces of artwork. Though this also means we had slightly fewer participants than we would have liked, and then they had to close the gallery and everything. But and then what we did is we told these participants just visit the American Art Wing, see every piece at least once, but that was it. You could go with a friend, you could see the pieces in any order. It could just be a totally naturalistic visit, and we didn't even have a researcher present all the time. Then, once they saw every piece in the American Art Wing, we had them exit the gallery or the exhibit and then answer a memory test on their smartphones where they saw various pieces of art and then had to rate whether they remember seeing it before or not. And so we had all of the pieces from the exhibit in the test intermixed with very similar lure images, an equal number of similar lure images. So these lure images came from the same artists, same time periods, same art styles, same content types. We were also curious what other properties might contribute to what people remember when they visit this exhibit. So we also ran a separate online experiment where we uploaded each piece and had separate participants rate 4 different attributes for the pieces. So they rated how beautiful was the painting, what emotions they felt when viewing the painting, how interesting they found the painting, and then how familiar they were with the painting. And we got ratings from 40 participants for each piece. And then we created this linear model to see what different factors predicted memory. So first, let me show you the predictors we put into our linear model. So we put in the floor. This was because there are actually 2 floors within the American Art Wing, and they were both very different. So the second floor had fewer pieces of more diverse art styles, while the first floor had more pieces and less diverse. So you can almost think of floor as a measure of like local context of within the experiment. We also included painting size because our neural network saw all the pieces at the same general size. We included those 4 attributes that I collected. We included the prediction from our neural network. And then we also included some interesting interactions. So we looked at whether this exhibit basically had many smaller rooms going off of a main room. So we were curious if the memorability or size of other pieces in a room influenced the memorability for a given piece. And we also included statistical interactions in our model. Yep.
I'm wondering, I know you didn't follow the participants around, but did they all enter and exit from the same place? And I'm wondering, is floor capturing something like a order in which you experience as well, or like a capacity?
Yeah, we actually counterbalanced which floor they started on. So that was one thing. We did tell them, okay, you start on the first floor and do the experiment or visit everything, or you start on the second floor. But within the floors, we don't know which order in which they saw the pieces. I feel like a future version of this study, we would record everything, do eye tracking, but because it was COVID times, it was hard to get like a researcher to go there every time. But the way it's designed, you could basically go around it either clockwise or counterclockwise, and those were probably the 2 main directions people experience the pieces. Yeah. Yeah, so let me show you which predictors ended up coming out as significant. So first, we did find a significant effect of the context. So this floor with fewer and more diverse pieces ended up being better remembered. We also found that bigger was better, so larger pieces were better remembered. Of the 4 attributes that we measured, surprisingly, no effect of beauty, emotion, or familiarity. So you can have an incredibly beautiful, emotion-evoking piece and be entirely forgettable. But the interestingness factor did have a significant predictive ability. We're not quite sure what people took into account when they judged the interestingness of a piece, so we're running a follow-up experiment right now to look at that. But importantly for me, our neural network's predictions were also a significant factor in what people remembered and forgot. And then for these other more interaction type predictors, the only interaction we found was that if you had a smaller piece, it benefited by being surrounded by larger pieces for memory, but we found no other interactions. And the R squared of the entire model was 0.44. So that means with all of these factors that we can measure and determine in advance, we can predict 44% of the variance in people's memory. And if we instead do a stepwise regression where we throw every property in there, we can get up to 53% of the variance, which means that a lot of what you remember when you visit an art museum is determined in advance, like something that an artist or curator can intentionally design. But also what's exciting for me is how well our neural network did. This means that we can predict what people remember in the messy real world. Yeah. Any questions so far? Yeah.
If I remember this paper, you also predict dwell time, like how long people take in the different rooms of the Art Institute.
We don't actually have dwell time measures, so that might be a different.
Okay, I'm conflating
Yeah.
it with something else.
Yeah, so we don't have many fine-grained measures about what the participants did in the gallery.
Okay.
But we do have a follow-up study we're running now where we created our own gallery and then we're able to get more measures there, so. Yeah, so one thing about the Art Institute is that we have several highly famous pieces. Like here are some pieces you'll see if you come visit us at Chicago. But as you might imagine, you would really remember if you saw the American Gothic in person. So for all the analyses that I showed you, we excluded the highly famous pieces from our analyses. And in fact, these pieces are labeled as famous within the Art Institute's collection because they need to know which pieces to use in their advertising materials versus which ones are not as important. So we were curious, what would our neural network ResMem think if we showed it these famous pieces of artwork? How memorable would it predict that they are? And what we found was that ResMem actually predicted higher memorability scores for famous versus non-famous pieces, which is really surprising because again, it wasn't trained on art. It doesn't know anything about culture, art history, or artists. So one thing is that maybe in a way we can predict the pieces that last in cultural memory. Like maybe there's something about highly memorable pieces that stick in your memory, cause you to tell other people to go visit or view that piece, and sort of maybe it's the memorability that partially makes a piece famous. Yeah. And this might seem like a sort of large claim, but we have some supporting evidence from another study that we have out now as a preprint. This was run by my former master's student, Shikong Peng, who's now a PhD student at Toronto. And what he finds is that our neural network ResMem can also predict social media success of images. So he scraped images from Reddit and then got their memorability scores from ResMem and found that memorability scores correlated with how many comments and how many upvotes people gave to the images. So more memorable images get more social media engagement. Yeah.
So I was wondering, these like famous paintings that you showed, maybe they were famous during the artist's lifetime or maybe they weren't. And this experiment seems like it's specific to like the time period that participants are viewing the images in. And so do you think there's a way to measure like this more like durable, like time averaged famousness that might be a more general property of our visual system versus like the more temporary, like cultural?
That would be so cool. Yeah, I haven't tried looking at it. I guess, yeah, because within the gallery, the American Art Wing, because it only had 166 pieces, it didn't have a ton that were famous. But within the whole collection, if we do it in like an online way, that would be really cool. Because I guess the prediction would be that pieces that become famous after someone's death might tend to be more memorable than those that were famous during someone's lifetime, right? Because during lifetime, maybe like their social influence that makes a piece famous versus maybe it's the inherent properties of the stimulus that makes it memorable after one's death. That would be so cool. Okay, I will definitely try that out. Yeah. Yep.
I'm just, you speak a lot about predicting.
Mhm.
Your model predicts, memorability. And I'm a little at loss here because I mean, I see correlations, right? A
Uh-huh.
lot of scatter. And I'm not sure you can call that really predictability.
Well, I guess what we're doing is predicting people's memory behavior. Maybe in here, I mean, you might imagine that so many different factors influence what becomes popular in social media. So for me, I feel like for this, a significant correlation is satisfying for me, but I think maybe the bar of satisfaction is different for different people. But for the art project, we could get up to explaining 53% of the variance in people's memory. I would say that's pretty good for predictive if we can predict over half of the variance in what people remember.
I mean, when you say pretty good, I think what you need is a reference, right? So for example, you study this. How well could you predict memorability?
Oh, so if you ask,
Person, right? So I mean, I don't know what to do with these numbers, right? These correlation factors or the variability explained. So how you compare that to what?
yeah, I guess if you want to predict it to human predictions, we have some work showing that people are shockingly bad at predicting what's memorable. There is some debate right now on how well people are depending on the stimulus, but for scene photographs, for example, there's a slightly negative but non-significant correlation between people's predictions of memorability and true memorability, which means that actually this neural network outpaces what people can do in terms of predicting what people will remember. And we've actually run a study. We have a preprint out where we try and train people to learn what's memorable and forgettable, but they can never reach the performance of the neural network. So I guess if it can predict our memories better than we can ourselves, I would say that's pretty good predictive ability. Yeah, any other questions? Yeah, so in terms of future directions for this work, right now we're looking at first, how do artistic decisions during the creation of a piece impact memorability? So we're analyzing YouTube videos where artists show how they create a piece, and then looking at frame by frame memorability and seeing what decisions really boost the memorability of a piece and what tank the memorability of a piece. We also have another study where we actually ran a nationwide art contest challenging artists to try and create memorable and forgettable pieces. And largely they were able to do so. And then we had a month-long gallery in the Chicago South Side where we showed the most memorable and forgettable pieces and then ran our same memory experiment. And broadly, we did find that our neural network could predict people's memory for those pieces too. If you're curious to hear more about this study, we're going to give a talk about it at VSS this year if anyone's going. Yeah. So far I've shown you that this memorability effect is widespread, that memory is predictable for this really subjective content type of art and in real world settings. And we've developed this AI model that can predict people's memory for these pieces of art. So before I continue on to my next section, any final questions about the art stuff? Yeah.
So I remember with the face stuff at the beginning, you mentioned different angles of the face or different expressions they're making, right? And so I'm wondering what this says about the specific, if it's about objects within the art versus just visual properties, like, so for example, if you manipulate using whatever, some DALL-E, whatever, AI to have a similar piece, but different visual properties or something like that, like, would that reduce memorability or is it more about the intrinsic nature of the art?
Yeah, so we actually find that for images, at least, it's more the higher order semantic content that governs memorability more than the low level visual features. Actually, I'm going to show a study where I took out the slide, but where we are able to validate these results looking at lots and lots of real world objects. But there is still a little bit of variance explained by the low level visual properties, like very small amount of variance, like 10% or something of the memorability effect. And we have a new preprint out where we've used that to try and take the same concept and then make a memorable or forgettable version of that concept. So make a memorable symbol for revenge and a forgettable symbol for revenge, just using these low level visual properties. And we find that we can indeed change people's memory in the direction we'd expect. So they are able to remember or recognize the memorable symbol version better, and they're able to call to mind what word was associated with it better too. So it is possible to use this to like engineer very memorable stimuli. Yeah. Yeah.
I think this is super interesting and really exciting. I am just curious whether you think this would also translate to more abstract art and more abstract concepts generally. Like, I know you said it also kind of worked for things like words and scenes, but these are all kind of like concrete.
Yeah.
So if you think it would also translate to like the modern way, for example.
Yeah, so we did try a version of the model where we put in the content type. So whether it's abstract, landscape, portrait, still life into the model, and that was actually not predictive of memory. So we didn't see huge memory differences based on content type, but it could be because maybe the American Art Wing didn't fully sample the different content types. So I think that would be really interesting. Because at least for the art contest we held, we're still analyzing that data, but qualitatively, it did look like the abstract pieces tended to be more forgettable, while the more like it's clear what that object is tended to be more memorable. And yeah, that might be something interesting to think back about once I show the second half of my talk too, because I feel like those two questions sort of interface with each other. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious how you reconcile that human subjects cannot predict memorability, but human artists can generate
Yeah.
more memorable images.
Yeah, good job picking up on that. Yeah, so that's one thing. So there is some work showing that artists do better than non-artists at some like visual tasks and some memory tasks. So it could be that, or visual memory tasks. So it could be that maybe the extensive training they have with like viewing the world lets them understand like what statistics are important for sticking in memory. Yeah, I think that would be really interesting to look at. That being said, they were largely able to, but there were cases where an artist would enter the memorable contest and then have one of the most forgettable pieces and then be shocked, like, why did I win a prize for the most forgettable piece? So it's not perfect. And oh, I guess one fun thing is we actually found a negative correlation or correlation of professional level and their ability to manipulate memorability. In other words, the more like amateur you were as an artist, the more you were actually able to manipulate memorability, which then maybe I need to think about what that means because that goes against what I just said about training. So yeah, we're still thinking a lot about this. Like it could be once you become professional, you have to like work in a way that's commercially viable, and then maybe that changes what your art looks like. Oh yeah, and
Curious, did you have eye tracking data for some of the images and there's a relationship between reliability of the locations where people looked at for highly memorable?
yeah, so we don't have that for the art, but there is some work looking at eye tracking with memorability and finding that oh, I forget exactly what this is from other labs, but they find that for memorable images, there does tend to be larger pupil sizes, but I forget what else they find in terms of fixation patterns. Yeah.
So you're talking about everything as if it's memory, but maybe it's distinguishing things, right? So the forgettable face might just be more like an average face, or the art that they don't remember might just be lots of 3-person figures. So how do you differentiate the two?
Yeah, I'm actually going to talk about that in my next section. So I'll hold off on that and maybe get back to that question. Yeah.
Have you ever broken up an image and then sent it back to people to see if they can recognize that from like the image? So like if they've gone to this museum and you send them, instead of giving them the whole image to look at again for these predictive things, you take like just a random segment of like a square, figure out based on using a larger population of individuals, you know, is there one particular part of that image that is actually more like that, like that's the significant part of it?
Yeah, so there has been some work making updated neural network models that can make a memorability map to show what is most driving the prediction. And actually it does work reasonably well to divide up the image as a mosaic and feed that into ResMem and get a predicted memorability score. That we actually have a collaboration with Marlene Cohen who does monkey work, where they find that if you split up an image into a mosaic and then show monkeys a mosaic in order of memorable segments, they remember the image better than if you show it in like a random order. So there really is something about like certain regions of the image are driving this memory effect. But it would be interesting. We still need to do more work to link that to like the semantics of what objects are present in the memorable regions and what does that mean about what makes something memorable. Yeah, so I'm sure many of you are asking what makes things memorable and how does this relate to things like the distinctiveness of an image? And so to look at what makes things memorable, we decided to look at basically all of the things. So there's this database called the Things Database developed by Martin Habart and colleagues, where they essentially scrape all the concrete nouns from an American English dictionary and then downloaded about a dozen images for each object in the dictionary. So they end up with this fairly comprehensive set of all concrete objects, images of all concrete objects, where they have over 26,000 images for 1,800 different object categories. And then with this data set of images, they also characterized how people, sort of behavioral dimensions that govern how people think about these images. So they basically had participants do a similarity task with these images and then found these 49 dimensions that captured 92% of the variance in this object similarity task. And then they also got human labels for what people thought that these different dimensions reflected. So they might reflect something about like whether an object is an animal or not, how colorful the object is, whether it's related to royalty or not. But these are still data-derived dimensions. And so we were curious, how do these different dimensions and object categories relate to memorability? So what I'm going to show you is a study run by Max Kramer, one of the former master students in my lab. And basically, we got memorability scores for every single image in the Things database. So over 1 million memory ratings with over 13,000 participants. And they did this exact same task where they saw a stream of object images and then had to press a key when they recognized a repeat. And importantly, we only ever had one exemplar per category. So we'd only have one chinchilla or one pair of shoes in a given participant's experiment. And so the key question is, given these memorability scores we have now for everything, how does memorability relate to the features of these objects? And so first, let me just show you some qualitative data. So here's what the spread of memorability scores look like here. I'll sometimes refer to corrected recognition or CR score. That's basically the hit rates taking into account the false alarm rates, like a combined measure for memorability. And so as you can see, there's this nice spread across the categories. Candy bar was the most memorable object category. And then, yeah, I can imagine why. And then windshield was the least memorable object category. And in that same consistency analysis, we found that, again, as we might expect, what people remember and forget. So memory performance is really consistent across people. So that means that you can think of each image as having an intrinsic memorability. We then looked at how these 49 dimensions correlated with memorability score. And essentially the takeaway here is that there's a wide spread. So we see some significant correlations, like objects that are related to body parts tend to be more memorable, or objects made of metal tend to be more forgettable. But no single dimension explains memorability effects. And it's also unclear how would you translate this to a totally different stimulus type like faces. So instead, we thought it's not any single dimension that predicts memorability. We also tried combining the dimensions into a multiple regression model. That also wasn't super predictive of memorability. So we were curious, is it instead something about where an item is located amongst these dimensions that relates to memorability? And so there are 3 different hypotheses you might have that are supported by different pieces of literature and how memorability relates to our sort of like cognitive map of objects. So the most intuitive hypothesis is that distinctive items should be the most memorable, right? Like very atypical weird things should be memorable. But we have some evidence from the neural domain that typical items are the most memorable. So we find that in neuroimaging, memorable items have more similar patterns to each other in the brain and visual areas than more forgettable items. And there's also some evidence that it might be a mixed relationship where maybe it's visually distinctive, but then semantically typical items that are the most memorable. So we wanted to test these 3 hypotheses with our 49-dimensional space with all of the objects. So to look at this, you can think of each image or each object as existing within a 49-dimensional feature space. And so the key question is, well, then you can calculate typicality measures by taking the 49-dimensional vector, or like basically the address within this 49-dimensional feature space, and then correlating it across different objects. So for example, to see how prototypical this picture of a chinchilla is, you might see how does its 49-dimensional vector correlate with other pictures of chinchillas? And if there's a high correlation, that means that it is highly similar to other chinchillas, and that means it's a more prototypical chinchilla picture. Sorry, I have 2 chinchillas at home, so. And so we can calculate this typicality measure for every image, and then see how does that relate to memorability. And so what we actually find is a positive correlation where more typical, more prototypical images tend to be the more memorable images as well. We can also do this at a superordinate level, where instead of looking at individual images, we can look at object categories within a superordinate category. So instead do the same computations, but look at what is the average similarity of this cat to other mammals, and get a sense of how typical is a cat amongst mammals and how does that relate to memorability. And there, what we find is a trend in the same direction, where prototypical object categories trend towards being the more memorable categories. We can also categorize typicality in another way by looking at a deep neural network feature space. So for that, you can feed each image into a deep neural network. Here, we don't use our ResMem neural network. We instead use a visual neural network that does object categorization, and specifically VGG16. And VGG16 has been shown to be a fairly good proxy of the human visual system, in that early layers of VGG16 resemble low-level visual processing in the brain. And then later layers of VGG16 reflect more like higher level, higher order semantic processing. And so we can compute these same measures of typicality at these different layers within the neural network to look at, is it like visual typicality that's related to memorability, or is it more later semantic typicality related to memorability? So basically for each of these layers, we can flatten it into a vector and then correlate the vectors across items within the same category. And so on the x-axis here, I'm going to show you the different layers of VGG16. On the y-axis, I'm going to show the correlation between our typicality measure for that layer and the memorability score. And what we find is the effects are relatively small. You can see the correlations are relatively low, but it's overwhelmingly positive, except for maybe some of these middle layers. So this suggests that it really is the more prototypical items that tend to be more memorable. So across these three different measures, we're getting evidence for the second hypothesis that typical items are more memorable, even though that might be a little bit counterintuitive to this idea that weird things should be memorable, right? Yep.
Wait, were you done with this summary of this section?
I'm going to go into more about this hypothesis, but about this study experiment, I'm done talking about it.
So I was wondering about the relationship between, or like a potential influence of a lot of the stimulus sets that we choose, and also like the, I think like historical development of DNNs is focused on object recognition. And I think a lot of these image sets are like structured by like choosing semantic categories and then filling the image set with like exemplars from each category. So I'm wondering like, and like, as I think you kind of like alluded to, that's maybe related to like things that are like going on in our like fully developed adult brains and like what we decide to take pictures of. And so I'm wondering, like, do you think that these types of effects develop like based on our visual experience, or do you think that you could like train a model that like simulated the human brain before development and it would show some of these same effects, or sorry, before visual experience?
Yeah, that would be really interesting to look at. And actually, some of what I'm going to show a little later might tie into this idea. It will give us a path forward even without having these discrete categories. In terms of development, so one cool thing is that our neural network can predict memory in kids as young as 4 years of age. But, you know, you definitely get lots of visual experience before you turn 4.
And they're
So-
verbal and like learning categories.
Verbal, yeah, and that's also when like hippocampal maturation seems to happen, like when childhood amnesia seems to go away. And we find that our neural network cannot predict memory in 3-year-olds, but 3-year-olds are internally consistent in that they remember and forget the same item. So it's not just that they don't remember or don't do the task, it's that they do the task in a different way. So this is also a big question for us right now is this switch happening between 3- and 4-year-olds something about visual experience, hippocampal maturation, something about plasticity changing, verbal. So if anyone wants to collaborate on looking at this, yeah, it's something we're actively really curious about.
That's super cool.
Yeah. Yeah, so as I mentioned, it's counterintuitive why typical items would be the most memorable. So why would it be that more memorable items are more similar to each other? And so one first glimpse into an answer for this was developed in a study in collaboration with Zane Shet, a faculty now at University of Maryland, where we did a memory experiment, a cued recall memory experiment with words. And our hypothesis that emerged from the study is that memorability might be a measure of how our cognitive maps or how our memory spaces are organized and how we search that space. In other words, if you think of, let's see, our semantic networks of words as like a network or a hierarchy, then memorable items might be those that are at the roots of this network, and then forgettable items are the leaves of this network. And we find evidence for this in that we see that memorable words tend to be recalled faster than forgettable words. They show earlier reinstatement in the brain using intracranial EEG recording. And also people are more likely to falsely recall memorable words. So it's sort of like, that's the first thing they go to. They can't remember an item, they'll go with that memorable root item. But can we test this hypothesis in vision using image-based stimuli? And so former master's student Fiona Lee, who's now a PhD student here at UPenn over there, led the study to ask this question by taking this 49-dimensional feature space that we have for images. And the question was, can we find a different tree-like geometric space to arrange these images to test this hypothesis that memorable items are at the roots of how we organize our cognitive maps? But how might we organize these images in a tree-like hierarchical space? Well, we can think again of each of our images as being a point within a multidimensional space. And usually when we measure similarity, we'll do something like calculate Euclidean distance, which is just basically, if you take a ruler out and measure the distance between 2 points, that's a Euclidean distance. But what we want is something like the discrete tree distance, which is basically a distance calculated by looking at the distance to common ancestors between 2 items. But this is something that cannot be easily calculated for continuous stimuli because not everything is going to necessarily have an ancestor, right? So we instead turn to something called hyperbolic geometry, where we can measure a hyperbolic distance between items, which is essentially a smooth approximation of a discrete tree distance. And how we can do this is instead of looking at our flat Euclidean spaces, we can instead look at a hyperbolic space. If the slide will load. Uh-oh. Oh, the hyperbolic space too. Okay. A hyperbolic space basically looks like this, where distances become farther, the farther away you get from the origin of the space. And so a key question is, how well does this different hyperbolic space do at capturing our cognitive maps of objects? And so we can take our Euclidean 49-dimensional space, turn it into a distance matrix where basically we calculate the pairwise Euclidean distances between every pair of items. And then there's a somewhat straightforward calculation you can do to transform it into the hyperbolic space. And then we did multidimensional scaling to find what was the best number of dimensions in order to capture our things data, the 49-dimensional features for things. And so when we do this with the Euclidean space, we find the best fit number of dimensions is 16 dimensions, which is relatively uninterpretable. Like, what do these 16 dimensions mean? How could we translate this to other categories of items? But for the hyperbolic space, we find the best fit space is only 3 dimensions, where one is the radius of an item, and then there's 2 angles. And I'll talk about radius shortly. We also measured, calculated a measure of best fit, a chi-squared measure, where basically the higher the chi-squared, that means the more different the space is from the empirical data. So in other words, the Euclidean space doesn't have that great of a fit with the empirical data, but the hyperbolic space has a great fit. And just to show you intuitively what these spaces look like, I'm going to plot our 1,800 different object categories in the 2 spaces, though mapped onto 3 dimensions. And so here are what the objects look like in the hyperbolic space and the Euclidean space. And as you can, we've colored them by broader superordinate category. And as you can already see, there are more intuitive clusters that form in the hyperbolic space related to broader categories like animal, foods, tools, and clothing, while the clusters are less apparent here in the Euclidean space. And so if we transform our object space to this hyperbolic space, we were curious, how might this relate to our hypothesis that memorable items are at the roots of our space? Well, I mentioned that we can characterize a hyperbolic space with just a radius and 2 angles for each object. And radius is really meaningful because that's the distance from the origin of the space. You can think that things that are closer to the origin are the more prototypical items that are more at the roots of our cognitive maps. And so we're curious, does radius relate to memorability? And we find indeed a significant negative correlation where the closer you are to the origin, the more memorable an item is. And we end up explaining 4 times more variance in this hyperbolic space than in the Euclidean space. So this led us to think that memorability might reflect an item's location in memory with memorable items at the roots of our cognitive maps. There's also a lot of other like interesting measures that we look at in this space that lets us explain more variance, but just for the sake of time, I'm gonna skip over those, but if people have questions, I can go into them.
I'm sort of
Yeah.
lost, but what was the original space based on? It was based on that.
Oh yeah, so we take the 1850, all the things, we have their 49 dimensional embeddings that characterize basically how they're perceptually judged. And we can transform that Euclidean, 49 dimensional Euclidean space into a hyperbolic space. So basically this space is like an object perceptual space.
So this
Yeah.
radius is not like the radius of like how memorable it is within the category. Sorry,
No.
how central it is within the category. It's like how central
It is within
within
all things. Yeah, but we do also look at relationships to within category and across category measures.
Yeah.
And basically the most memorable items are those that are closest to the center of the whole space, but also those that are closest to other items within its same like cluster, but also items that are really far from other clusters. Yeah. Yeah, so in terms of future directions, we're now curious, when we had the 49 dimensional or 16 dimensional Euclidean space, those dimensions were specific to the stimuli we were looking at, right? Like object features. But when we have these 3 dimensions in the hyperbolic space, we can transform any space, whether it's like faces, objects, voices, words, we can transform any of those into our 3-dimensional hyperbolic space and test this question about radius. So we're curious to see if we can create a generalized model of memorability across domains. We're also curious to see how different measures of hits versus false alarms relate to the location of the space, because there's all this classic memory work on how sort of cognitive spaces relate to these 2 measures. Yeah, so I've shown you that memory is predictable from the images that we're viewing, even in these really real world settings. And it's predictable to the extent that AI can predict what you'll remember in the real world. And we've also shown that memorable items might reflect how items are positioned within our cognitive maps. And really excited to hear your thoughts, especially the hyperbolic geometry stuff. It's like fresh off the presses as a preprint. So I'm really looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Yeah, just following up your hyperbolic space.
Yeah.
The distance from the center, right? So I mean, somebody brought up abstract art.
Yeah.
It should be far out there, right?
Yeah.
So would you, I mean, clearly, would that mean you can't memorize abstract art? You know, intuitively, that sounds like kind of approximately right. But I don't know.
Let me pull up this slide again, showing the 2 spaces. So one question we're really interested in is, you see here in the hyperbolic space, there's this big empty area. So what's in that empty area? Like maybe abstract art's in that area. And one cool thing is you can use like generative AI like GANs to create the stimuli that exist in that empty area. And then maybe we can make specific predictions about how well people would remember these totally novel stimuli based on their radius. We intentionally engineer something that's close here or far out here, and then we can predict what people would remember or forget. And maybe abstract art is there, yeah.
This is so cool. So there's work on kids' conceptual spaces and even maybe like, you know, how is their hierarchical tree of concepts different at different ages?
Oh,
So
cool.
could you use that? I mean, you could also just get the judgments from kids, I guess, on the direct like things. What's similar to what thing, but would that allow you to predict the younger kids? Like,
That would be that would be really cool. Yeah, and one thing about like prior work using hierarchical trees means that you have to use these like highly constructed stimulus sets or have them learn like the hierarchical nature of objects. But what's great about this hyperbolic method is that it works with any sort of continuous feature space. So you can more flexibly, you can even take pre-existing kid memory data, take those stimuli, run them through this algorithm, and then get like the hyperbolic space measures and map it onto their memory performance. So yeah. And so one thing about this hyperbolic work is with the paper, we're really trying to make it easy to understand. And the hope is that in the next few months, we'll have a package that'll make it really easy to implement these measures. So if anyone's curious in testing things out, basically you can send in your feature space. It'll give you the hyperbolic version of the distance matrix. And then you can test out these hyperbolic measures for yourself too. Yeah.
Really great talk, thank you.
Thanks.
I'm wondering if you could predict like false alarm rates, like in a DRM type task, right? So if I show you a bunch of pictures of chinchillas and then wait a while and then show you the more memorable prototypical one that was left off of this study list, could I get you to false alarm to it? And is that false alarm rate predicted by how close it is to the center of this?
Yeah, so that's one question we're trying to figure out the answer to, and that exactly false alarm rate, you would also predict that items that are more prototypical cause more false alarms, but our memorable items are those that have few false alarms. So it's like, how do we reconcile these two things? And we actually, in some work we're writing up right now, we're finding that false alarm rate and hit rate are orthogonal to each other. They're not correlated, which means that they probably represent different things about the space. And we actually find that you can create these weird, like two alternative forced choice trials where you would predict that if it's all about like a singular distance in the space, that people would perform symmetrically no matter what's the target or what's the foil. But we can find these asymmetries, basically where it seems like false alarm rates relying on one measure of distance and hit rates relying on another. And we think some of it might be related to. So in this hyperbolic work, we actually also look at two different measures of typicality. I was mentioning this to Russell briefly, but basically we find that the most memorable items are those that have a lot of typicality within cluster, like within category typicality, where and then memorable items also are very distinctive from items in other categories. So it might be something about these two different measures that relate to separately to hits and false alarms. But it's still like a big question mark that we're working on. Yeah.
I have sort of a broad and silly sounding question.
No silly questions.
Are the advertising people like all over you about this?
Yeah.
Or like, do they already know and that's why I can't get the Febreze like song out of my head about intrinsic memorability?
Yeah, so it has caught the attention of some advertising folks, and we are right now in like negotiations with a brand about a company about like whether we want to do research collaboration without compromising the quality of our science. Yeah, I mean, some of it is we try to make everything as publicly available, open source as possible. And one thing that gives me a glimmer of hope is we have one study where we look at whether memorability influences decision-making for at least food choices. And we find no there. So even if someone remembers a memorable piece of food better, they won't choose it, which makes me think that hopefully we don't always choose memorable things. And it's not that companies can make memorable ads that force you to buy things. Yeah. But we'll see. Stay tuned. Yeah.
Does state of mind influence whether something, does it influence like the memory?
State of mind?
Yeah, so like if you're stressed, are you more or less likely to like, does the system hold up where like, you know, if I'm stressed, do I recognize a spider or a snake more regularly than like, I don't know, a cat or a dog, and like in that terms of like, I don't know.
We haven't tried it with stress, but we've tried it with attention, like your level of sustained attention. And what we find is whether you're paying attention or not, like even if you're totally not paying attention, you will remember a memorable item. But if you want to show someone a forgettable item, you should wait until they're really paying attention. So we have one study talking about how you could design an adaptive interface that when someone's not paying attention, you can afford to give them memorable things. And then when they're paying attention, you can afford to give them forgettable things and sort of maximize what they remember, which you could be useful for like educational contexts. Yeah. But they're generally orthogonal in that Yeah, they're both orthogonal, so they're sort of like two knobs that you can independently manipulate to influence memory.
Something you presented might have already answered this, and I might not have just connected the dots, but I'm wondering, like, are you interested in separating effects of like perception and encoding and storage? And like another related thought is, I don't know if you've talked to Tim Brady about like TCC stuff and how that relates to this. And if you like accounted for like perceptual similarity in some way, like would you expect to still find memorability effects?
Yeah, so for your first part of your question, we're finding that this is a really fast effect. So you can decode the memorability of an item within like 150 milliseconds of stimulus presentation, which means that it does seem like it's like a higher order perceptual effect that happens like before encoding. So some of my hypothesis is that it might be like a mechanism that you can't remember everything you see. We have to filter information some way. So maybe this is picking up on like the prioritization metric that the brain uses to know what to encode into memory. So I think it's a encoding based phenomenon. Though there has been some work showing that memorable items, even after encoding, gain extra boosts, like between holding something in working memory and consolidating into long-term memory. Yeah, so yeah, and then for the TCC model, I've thought about it because it makes sense that maybe these memorability might be some of the priors that then influence the model. So yeah, Tim and I have an email saying that we will schedule a meeting around the VSS time to chat about these things. So yeah.
I very quickly asked about the voices.
Yeah.
Because when you said that, I was like actually wondering if this would correlate with like political success.
Yeah.
You probably want to use politicians from another country. You know, who's familiar with like Canada, I don't know, right?
Yeah.
So, you know.
And yeah, one thing for the voices, this is very preliminary, but we might be finding that maybe memorable voice, if you hear a memorable voice, you might also remember the content of what they're saying better than if you hear from them.
As well, right?
Yeah, or podcast speakers.
I predicted I have a very unmemorable voice.
I don't think so. But
Yeah.
oh, okay. So,
For success, yeah. But I mean, yeah, but that's something, yeah, obviously a nice real world thing to test. Yeah.
yeah, so we've been trying it with faces actually to see, we're looking at, does the memorability of a face relate to one's celebrity status? So we're testing celebrities and non-celebrities in India and Brazil with Indian and Brazilian participants. So they basically don't know the celebrities of the other country.
Yeah.
And the question is, do they still remember the celebrities' faces better than the non-celebrities' faces? And if so, that might suggest that part of what makes you famous is having a memorable face.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about the voice.
Yeah, and so if that works, we're definitely gonna try it with the voices too. I think that'd be
Right.
cool. And also with foreign languages, that lets us get away from content more and it really be about the voices themselves. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much.